toys and books that are written today, even though they were grown men. My Uncle Marion, by the time I was old enough to go to Coloma, he could just point and cry. And it wasn't until recently that I realized what those tears represented. In the last 72 hours, thanks to the Department of Justice, I was informed that, yes, laws were actually passed through the legislation to allow the governor, well, not the governor, the attorney general and legislators to condemn property and not pay families. I was also made aware of that my grandfather and his two brothers, my Uncle Marion, were threatened to be prosecuted by the same state that's supposed to be free in the event they didn't sell their land. And what I know now from seeking all this truth is that the land was all that we had left. We had farmland, lots of it, because our time in Coloma started in 1849, when my great-great-grandfather was brought to California. Picture sits there behind me. His name was Rufus Burgess. That hung over our fireplace for years. My mother always told me, my father, that's your great-grandfather, he was one of the first pioneers to actually arrive in the town of Coloma. And my dad documents he was there when gold was discovered. Censored records show Rufus Burgess in El Dorado County in 1849. And if you look at Miss Beasley's book, Delilah Beasley, he's the only African-American man listed in the town of Coloma in 1849. And he established a lot, orchards, farmland, even the African church, which no one seems to know about today, although there are records and it was clearly documented. The family holds these today. As far as I'm concerned, that African church is the manual church and it's surrounded by orchards, which again, people, parts of institutions don't want that to come true. So not only did it establish all that, like most early gold miners that came here, they worked and got their freedom. You know, thanks to Marilyn Demas, she was a true historian and a truth seeker. Tina Alexander has been extremely helpful as well in some of the state parks. But thanks to them, I found that not only was he brought here, he was sold once he was here. See, I struggle with the problem or the issue of knowing that this man behind me was listed as my great-grandfather, but yet we had his Bible, something that families keep for years. And inside his Bible was an autobiography. I didn't understand why, and I questioned my mom, why does he have the name Nelson? That's Rufus Burgess. And thanks to him, and he tells you his life, he could read and write. He left us a map, a gold mine. But these stories have been unacknowledged by the state of California. It wasn't until my adulthood and my own research that I was able to piece together how, in fact, he became Nelson Bell. And I question, as I'm doing the research, and these 4 years of research, going through the state parks, working with the institutions. And I don't blame the institutions because at the end of the day, California is an institution. And the institutions never work for us, Black people in America, Black people in California. So how can I expect those people that work for the institution to help me? I'm hoping that you guys do that. But in discovering the Marshall Gold discovery, as I'm doing research, the binder, there's a white binder that was there. My mother wrote letters. She wrote letters back in the 70s, 80s, 90s about our families, so the park knew about it. Nelson Bell, who's Rufus Burgess, was on the first map of 1857, but sadly, when you go to the park today, there's no mention of any existence of his house or him. In fact, the Burgess family, who established a lot, was part of the Colored Citizens Convention. My great-grandfather actually is listed as a secretary-treasurer in the church building in 1862. I couldn't understand why reverends and pastors around the nation weren't outraged that when you go to the gold discovery site, there's no mention. There's a Chinese church or building. There's a Methodist church or building. And there is also a Catholic church or building. And documents will share, I care not to get into them now, that the Methodist church actually became the African church. But people don't want to believe that. So I ask myself these questions. Question, why state park officials or the institutions, the California institutions, and not the people in the parks, because they work there and understand it. They make little to no mention of the pioneer Burgess family when so much was established. And yet there's legislation showing the land that was condemned. I asked why the home of Nelson Bell, who was actually listed as the only black man, the mulatto in the town, is not talked about. In fact, my last visit at the church, I asked them, what park officials, I asked when they were going to tell me how they wanted to talk about the site of gold discovery. I asked them, why don't we talk about what we know? Why is the home of Nelson Bell not listed on the map? I can go to the park today. Do you know what it would make little black kids feel like to go and see and know that something was established? See, our institutions have not only hurt the direct descendants, it's hurt others from fabricated stories. There's something that says dead people don't tell tales. You're right, they don't. They can't lie. They can't make up anymore. And all I want is the truth. That's all I wanted. But I found it. I hope that you guys ask questions. Frequently in visiting the park, my brother and I were asked once they found out we're Burgess, what do you know about the land on the north side of the hill? What am I supposed to know about the land on the north side of the hill? I don't know. I know that our family was in the town from 1849 until they were forced out of the town. And yet in the first township map of Coloma, there's not one African American listed. In fact, I know that Nelson Bell, well, he went back to using the name Rufus at some point, but he was buried under a slave named Nelson Bell. I know in my own research that Dr. Berry mentioned that there were a number of people in El Dorado. I know that there were colored citizens that were sending money to fund the convention from their gold digging. And I know there was a preaching point in El Dorado County. Reverend Jennifer was actually appointed for 6 preaching points, with Coloma being a stop. That's more than 100 people. In fact, there's documents of a couple hundred people being inside the church. There's a 2006 document that the State of California Parks Division knew of the existence of the building, but requested the late Marilyn Demas to not reveal the site for fear of vandalism. And yet when I go there today, I'm told there was an African church that our family once owned. See, maps are a figment of imaginations. The worst thing that I'd say is that, you know, our historic home that had been in the family since the early 1860s was razed in 1950 by state employees. Nobody seems to know where that home was. Just recently, I was given a document, thanks to DOJ, of what they believe is the Burgess home. And I questioned where that actual home was, because my mother wrote documents, and I know from records and deeds that we own multiple homes now. But yet the property was condemned, for which you could pay nothing for it. And although all of our property, there was only one parcel of property that my great-grandmother Josephine sold, and she sold it to Mr. Gallagher, who actually came after the gold rush. She sold the property in 1901, but Gallagher, I think, arrived in 1860. Now, I've reached out to Assemblymember Gallagher because I know there's some correlation and relation, but you know, silence is complacency. I don't know the reality behind it, but I do know that there was a bunch of land behind the blacksmith range hall. And in books I've seen is that Melvin Gallagher Ranch. Melvin Gallagher was born the same time my grandfather was, and we had been in the town already at least 10, 15, 20 years and established a great deal. I'll say this, our family has endured a lot. And not only our family from the falsities of what California's done, other families have endured it too. When I say other families, it's not anyone's fault that people were made to be something that they're not. In fact, I'd be embarrassed if I knew that my direct descendant had did things that have been done to us. And there may be a call, and I hate to say it, but there may be a call for reparations for that too, because it was the institution that actually put these people up to be on pedestals and didn't tell the true history. And yet they suppressed our history. And so I would ask that this task force and this council, I was asked to put together some things of what reparations looks like. Well, my family's been without land, been forced off of land. And it was farmland. There are documents of actually farming, sending fruit throughout the valley of Coloma, El Dorado, and Placer counties. I'd ask that the land that we know, which I believe Nelson Bell, his home, I believe to be where the California State Library, Marshall Discovery Library is sitting on that property. And now when I go to state parks or prisons, I look at properties different. What I've learned is that the tactics that were used here were used all over the place. I'd ask to put together a short list of what reparation would look like, and I'll say something real quick. The institutions, I've got a list. The institutions were, in fact, responsible. The state of California is one of them. Our family doesn't need to have any more loss. I've lost both my parents, 2 daughters to COVID, and I've got contracted it myself. I want immediate restitution. I've got a brother that's been sitting behind institutional bars for the last 27 years for a murder he didn't commit, but yet the institution's here. And so I would ask the governor an executive order the same way. That an order was just about done to kick my grandfather and his brothers off of their land, to do the same for the Burgess family. And that comes with restoring property that was taken, wrongfully taken. And for the people up there that are sitting on the property today that own it, it's not your fault. And I'd say this, I don't want to kick you off. That's why reparations is due too. Because you had no idea that when the maps were there in 1872 or whenever they were placed and this reconstruction occurred, what you were getting into. And if you did, can't say that I wouldn't have taken advantage of it too, but you've maintained the property this long. But for any state building, any state park, any state institution, those properties should be returned to actual owners in leases enacted for 200 years, and they pay all the back pay with restitution. That would be fine for the Burgess family and any other family that's proven whose land was wrongfully taken. Your legislative practices that discriminated against descendants of slaves in California. My name's Jonathan Burgess, and I'll rest the mic and be open for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess, for that incredibly moving and thorough personal testimony. At this time, we have an hour for comments and questions from task force members that will be posed to Professor Smith, Professor Berry, and Mr. Burgess. At this time, Vice Chair Brown, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the task force, to our guests who've given their perspective. You know, this is a very emotional and sad occasion for me personally. Because we have attempted in America to tell the story. But because we so much have been infected with bias, racist action, and often imposed upon by narratives that were not our story, but his story, and consequently not true history. I wish to say that I'm a witness also to these fine presenters. But let me tell the whole story. The whole story. The whole truth and nothing but the truth. We should stop sanitizing the evil ways of one Peter Burnett. You've been too kind to him in the history books. And Ms. Smith, the truth be told, it was Peter Burnett who led the first wagon train westward in 1843. And he came from that state of Tennessee, where one Andrew Jackson also came from. So he was infected with this evil. of race and oppression. He was reared in Missouri, but when he came westward in 1843, one of his orders for that wagon train that he led was that no blacks or mulattoes would be permitted to be a part of that wagon train. And when he got up to the Oregon Territory, what did he do? When he settled that first little town, he established an ordinance not about how a cabin should be built or how a road should be built, but it was the Peter Burnett flogging law that stipulated any black or mulatto who was caught in that town would be beaten every 6 months until he or she left town. And the man came down here in 1848, California, still leaving droppings of his infectious, racist, inhumane, evil mind. And he got involved in politics and became the first governor from 1849 to 1851. And the whole story, Ms. Smith, is that he was on that Supreme Court after even he left office in disgrace because some debts in the Midwest caught up with him. And all of this is documented in a book entitled The Troubled Life of Peter Burnett. But the point I want to make is, this man was responsible for voting with the minority opinion on that Supreme Court of the state of California when that civil rights case of R.C. Lee was argued. He was the one who sided with enslavement. He was the one who infected this state with that virus of racist politics. So I hope that when we tell the story from now on, we tell the whole truth, not sanitize it, that this state has been mean to black folks because from the very beginning, the man who was the governor was indeed an evil racist and was against Native Americans. He pushed legislation against them and also anti-immigration matters against Asians and more specifically Chinese. Finally, I want to say, Madam Chair and friends, thanks for indulging me. I speak as a witness, also from the state of Mississippi, where R.C. Lee came from, with Stovall. Stovall tried to hire him out to raise money to take care of his personal needs and to build a school up in Sacramento. Stovall, yes. Ultimately, he went back to Mississippi. But R.C. Lee's days were cut short in this earth because he too was a part of that group of the migration contingency that left in 1858 because blacks could not testify in courts. They could not get schooling. They could not get housing. They could not get jobs. They got on that ship, the Commodore, at the invitation of Governor Douglas, who said, if they won't respect you in California and Mississippi and give you your rights, come on up to British Columbia. I've set aside some land on Victoria Island. And out of that contingency, there were founders of the historic Third Baptist Church that I've pastored now for 45 years. And they built that community. And they were achievers. And they did not accept this notion that they were inferior and that they were not persons of dignity and resource and ability. So let us, I repeat, tell the whole story. And the other matter is, we don't say much about Colonel Allensworth, Allen Allensworth, in 1908, right down here near Tulare, established a community called Allensworth Town. And do you know what happened? It was because of white racism that they couldn't get water, clean water continuously in that community. What did he have in mind? He had in mind building, replicating Tuskegee Institute in the West. Now, somebody said they didn't want any emphasis for a school. But let me tell you, those black schools were finishing schools for us. Morehouse, Fisk, Atlanta University, Spelman, St. Augustine, Shaw. So it's no harm to have a boarding school where young people can relate to each other. That's what Allensworth had in mind, a place where we would create our own little Egypt and be freed from the racist, bigoted minds and practices that began with Peter Burnett. And that's where it all started. He laid the seed and the foundation, and we should not be gentle with him at all. And finally, I know I said it the second time as a Baptist preacher, I got thanks to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The facts, and nothing but the facts, no opinionated statements. But my great-great-grandfather, Patrick Brown, was born an enslaved man in 1821 in Franklin County, Mississippi. And in 1882, he fought so much enslavement and the idea that a black man should not have the capacity to be in charge of something. He bought, according to these records from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, 150 acres of land and paid $700 for it and had receipts for every payment. Every payment. And he talked to 3 white men and talked them into adding on another acre of land. What was the purpose? To build a school and to build a church that became Bethlehem Baptist Church. That church still exists, and it was in the town of Roxy, Mississippi. And who else came from Roxy? Nathan Wright, who wrote Native Son and Black Boy. I think I've said enough, but I'm full of the subject because we got to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And that's why we as black folks deserve reparations. And it shouldn't be no big debate, but it ought to be a programmatic effort that will help us like our ancestors deal with education, have that 40 acres of new in the form of real estate, and also be involved in measures that would give us health care and give us also that place where we would have our own watering hole, like the Tuskegees, like the black churches that have brought us all the way. Thank you for indulging me, but I want us to always tell the whole story and lay it at the feet of the mind, the attitude, and the politics of the first governor of this state.
Thank you, Vice Chair Brown, for that robust comment. I want to now recognize Professor Smith in the event that she wanted to comment on Vice Chair Brown's comment, particularly if you wanted to share more information about Peter Burnett. Although I acknowledge the information that you did give us on this figure. I don't see Professor Smith.
Yes, she's there.
Okay.
She's muted.
Many apologies. My my laptop died all of a sudden, and so I missed that question right at the wrong moment. Could you repeat that for me, please?
Oh, yeah, just Vice Chair Brown. He was talking about Peter Burnett and just elucidating more about his history. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity if you wanted to share more about him as a figure.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much for repeating that question for me, and I apologize for my technical difficulty. Yes, I mean, I agree with Dr. Brown that Peter Burnett's a very important person in the history of California, of racism. Everything that Dr. Brown said is absolutely true. One thing I would add on is that Burnett was really insistent that the state of California should pass this Black exclusion law. The Constitutional Convention in 1849 couldn't agree about it, and there were lots of concerns that the free states in the North would prohibit California from becoming a new state if they tried to put that anti-Black exclusion law in. And so the Constitutional Convention said, let's leave it for the legislature to do. And the legislature did try to do this 4 times. And the first couple of times were because Peter Burnett gave in his executive address a big chunk of those addresses dedicated to the idea that the state of California needed to exclude Black people right now, that there were already too many in the state, that they were going to cause a race war. He said, basically there's going to be a war between Black people and white people because people have been denied so many rights in California already that they're going to be very upset. And since this is a whites only state, it's better to keep African Americans out than to let them come here, become discontented with the white supremacist law here, and then rebel against white people. So he claimed he was a humanitarian for wanting to exclude Black people, at the height of hypocrisy. So at the very last, though, I do agree very much that Peter Burnett is a foundational racist influence on California history. We shouldn't let all of these other legislators off of the hook. That these laws wouldn't have gotten so much. They didn't. California legislators did not pass those Black exclusion laws. And there's complicated reasons why, but there were a lot of people who wanted to, and the ones that were almost passed after the Archie Lee incident, when there was a lot of free Black activism and a lot of white backlash against that activism, that almost went through. It didn't because of just a legislative technicality. So there was support for this, right? We can't let those other legislators off the hook. They were following Burnett's lead, definitely, but also a lot of these other early state politicians completely complicit in these oppressive anti-Black laws.
Thank you, Professor Smith. Now I would like to recognize any task force members. They have questions for our experts and for Jonathan Burgess. And I'm not seeing the full chat, so if you have a question, please speak up. But if not, I do have a question for Professor Berry. So for Professor Berry, thank you again for your thorough and incredibly moving expert testimony, and I truly appreciated you centering the voices of the enslaved in the preface of your comments and in the conclusion of your comments. I would like to ask my question, but also couch my question in a preface and a conclusion as well. So recently I was able to travel to Louisiana before Hurricane Ida, and I was able to, this was just about a month ago, I was able to tour the Whitney plantation, which is the only plantation in the United States. It's a museum, but it's the only plantation museum in the United States that centers the voices of the enslaved. And there I was able to get a personal tour of the plantation with Dr. Ibrahim Asek. He's of Senegalese origin, and he has a PhD in African history. And there, during that personal tour, he shared with us the idea or the fact that many of enslaved Africans were taken from the west and central coast of Africa, particularly for the skills they had, right? And, related to rice cultivation and other types of cultivation. So I was wondering if you could speak to, or if you had any information that you could impart on to us about that, like the idea that, enslaved Africans or enslaved Black folks were taken, not only for their physical labor, but for their intellect and for their skills, right? Because in my conclusion with that and asking that question is that it seems as if, in acknowledging that, it deepens the argument for reparations, because it kind of negates the arguably like an unfortunately common idea or conception that enslaved people were nothing more than unknowing brute laborers just performing their master's task. I'm really curious to understand, whether, it's important, whether how important it is to acknowledge the stolen intellect and skill, not only the physical labor. Can you speak to that, Professor Berry, please?
Sure, I'd be happy to. That's a great question. One way, I'm always going to talk in evidence as well, because I know you might need that. When you look at newspaper advertisements for sales, or when you look at newspaper advertisements from the colonial era all the way through the end of slavery in 1865, there are records that describe where people were coming from in different parts of Africa and what skills they had, and they were bringing them with them. And so newspaper after newspaper after newspaper, broadsides, which were the posters they put up to advertise sales, they post them all over town centers and cities. They would say, a parcel of Negroes from the Gold Coast is coming that are skilled with the cultivation of rice. They're blacksmiths. They'll list the trade skills they had, but also the skills with agricultural products. What happens when Africans arrive and they're forced to labor, new skills are also learned because they see that they've been doing so much of this cultivation and other types of skills that they had that they brought with them. And one form of resistance, because I always like to balance out when I talk about the institution, and I always like to emphasize that this was not a passive history where Africans did not resist and they just went along with this journey. No, they resisted at every single moment of their capture and experience to this country, and even when they arrived here, they continued to resist. But one of the forms of resistance was to pretend like they didn't know how to do the things that they were being asked to do, to pretend like they didn't know how to count, to pretend like they didn't know how to use farm instruments, to pretend like they didn't know how to read maps, to pretend like they didn't know how to read and write for those that learned in the later period. So there were a number of skills. We have those skills identified. Some of them are identified in the census records. Some of them are identified through, as I tell my students all the time, we spend a lot of time looking at the records of the enslaver to tell the stories of the enslaved. So in their letters and in their diaries, in their agricultural account books, in their tax records, they talk about enslaved people and their skills are elaborated on. And they talk about the different things that they learned from enslaved people. They talk about how they were able to solve problems on plantations. But I also want to impress upon this body that enslaved people were not just laboring in fields or domestic workers in homes. They were also in a number of other settings. And I've talked about this in my research as well. But you find enslaved people, as I mentioned, in medical schools, serving in dissection rooms, not just their bodies, but also there were enslaved men that were working as janitors, but they knew the human body better than anybody else. So they were skilled individuals that also knew the waterways and the estuaries around coastal South Carolina and Georgia. They knew how to, they could deliver packages and other kinds of things because they knew how to navigate those waters. They were skilled enslaved men that were divers and what we would call lifeguards today. Kevin Dawson writes about this in his work. So there's a number of skills. I could go on and on. My first book was on enslaved people in labor and their skills, and I found that they worked anywhere from 12 to 18 hours a day before they were then going back to their cabins. And oftentimes they had work assignments in the evening where women had to sew and do other things for the plantation community. Some women were serving as wet nurses, where they were breastfeeding the Black and white babies. That was a skilled nurses. You'd see that listed in advertisements. So we have evidence of all of this, and we can literally identify 30 to 50 to 75 or 100 different types of skills just from the written record alone. And that doesn't even count the archaeological record, the kinds of things that we find under the ground. It doesn't count the oral histories that we've learned and the stories and the testimonies that pass, and it doesn't count the history from Black families. I highly recommend information wanted ads that are, there's a website from Villanova University called Last Seen. Heather Williams writes about this in her book, Help Me to Find My People, where African Americans were trying to connect with relatives that were taken from them or sold away during slavery. These advertisements were in newspapers through the 1920s. And they had advertisements. I would say this is the early history of Black genealogy from Black people's perspective, where they're saying, I'm trying to find my mother. She was sold away from me 40 years ago when I was 2 years old. I remember her name was Lucy and her hair was this length, but that's all I know. She had a smock on her when she left. She was about this complexion. I think she went to Alabama. Those ads were placed over and over and over again in newspapers. That's another starting point to learn about skills. And also in the papers in the Civil War era, when you look at the Freedom Claims Commission records, which are now available through Ancestry, I think it's all free now and accessible. But those are when African Americans were writing and making claims to land, just like Mr. Burgess was talking about, making claims to land, livestock that they owned during slavery, and they wanted it back. So those are just two places, two types of sources that we can find evidence of skills and possession of property that they tried to claim. I hope that answers your question.
Oh, yes, that more than answers my question. Thank you so much for that information. At this time, are there any members of the task force that would like to be recognized? Yes, this is Don Tamaki, you are recognized.
Thank you. I just want to make a comment, just stream of consciousness thoughts. I really appreciate the power of the personal narrative. And really, Professor Berry and Professor Smith, and certainly Jonathan Burgess, really appreciate that. I think it also creates a methodological path forward on the listening sessions. I know that in the Japanese American reparations efforts, it was personal narrative, even more so than the organizational testimony that moved the needle of public opinion. And I so appreciate, viewing this, the problem that you're illustrating through the eyes of the victims. Thought that was really good. For me as an Asian American, I'm always looking for areas of intersectionality. Again, not equivalence, but intersectionality, where other people, non-Black folks, have a reason to support Black reparations. And Professor Smith, in your discussion of the Fugitive Slave Act from 1852 to 1855, and in particular, the prohibitions against Black people testifying in court. Of course, that was true for Chinese Americans as well. There's a 1854 case of People versus Hall, which struck down the testimony of a Chinese man, saying he was not eligible, not qualified to testify. And what the history doesn't note so well is that led to being open season on people of color. It allowed people to be attacked, murdered, have properties stolen with impunity. And so I think the task force would be a great service to educate the California public on the consequences of institutional policy. And then to Jonathan Burgess, you know, as a family who's had their own property confiscated under the guise this time of redevelopment and eminent domain and condemnation, I really sympathize with your family's predicament. I appreciate your story. And again, I think it provides just another basis for how we might relate your stories to the greater history of California and why something has to be done about this. So thanks and appreciation to all the speakers.
Thank you, Member Tamaki. I had a question and comment for, oh, sorry, Member Holder, you are now recognized.
Thank you. I wanted to thank all of the speakers for your illuminating, heartfelt comments. I have a question that I wanted to direct toward Mr. Burgess in terms of some of the challenges that you faced in finding out about your family's history and all of the suffering that your ancestors faced. You know, in so many ways, I thought your story, it was so heartfelt and it was so touching and moving. And I felt a great deal of distress for you. I also felt some envy, quite frankly, because, you know, you have the picture of your great-grandfather in the back, right behind you, you know, a connection to his spirit, you know, that is so visual and so palpable. And so many of us don't even have that. We are dealing with a total erasure. You know, we have no idea, we know how our ancestors and predecessors suffered, but we don't know what they look like. We don't know anything about them because they were systematically erased. So I feel like as descendants of enslaved people, you know, we are all, so many, we're dealing with different levels of erasure. If you know who your ancestors were, you have some visuals, you're dealing with the suffering and the erasure, the information that you're now putting together about how they were erased throughout history. And if you don't know who your ancestors were, you're dealing with total erasure because you know nothing about their history. And so just bringing my comments back to the body, the Reparations Task Force, and why we're here and why it's so important to hear your story is because one of the things that I think is so profound is how difficult it is, whether or not you know who your ancestors are, to find little pieces of information about your ancestry. How expensive and burdensome and challenging that search can be. And that is something that should inform this task force when we are thinking about reparations and who the community of interest is, and whether we want to limit it to people who just know their history or whether we want to make it expansive and broad, recognizing that most African Americans have too many obstacles that have purposely been put in our way so that we can't find out about our ancestry and that history. So I want to talk to you specifically about some of the obstacles that have been put in your way. And so even though you have some crumbs, it's so hard to understand the whole pie, you know, to put it all together. What are some of the specific obstacles you face in trying to put your family story together?
Member Holder and task force, the obstacles really have been just getting the family artifact. What I wasn't able to share because of the time constraints was, you know, in doing some of this research and really being a pioneer family where there's a library and we talk about history, to be asked by a volunteer docent who's not even a historian. What do you know about Ida? What do you know? I know I had an Aunt Ida, but what do you mean, what do I know about Ida? And to have to, thanks to, I'm going to give Senator Dolly props, because without a public records request, this is still just a portrait. I don't have the originals. These are challenges, and as far as I'm concerned, that's Burgess family property that the California State Parks still possesses today. Even along with my mother's letters, because she began writing the parks, like I said, in the 80s and 90s. They knew about the autobiography of the man behind me, who was our great-great-grandfather, and that picture's been in our family for over 170 years. But yes, because he could read and write, we were able to put pieces together, but there was really no help, and I really blame the institutions for not sharing truthful history. Simply the fact that there being an African Methodist Episcopal body, not a church, body, it was never rebuilt in 1863 in the town of Coloma, and it's not being mentioned today. It's a crime. There's a Pacific Appeal newspaper where my great-grandfather, his actual son, dark-skinned guy, and of course the oral narrative is he would marry the darkest woman he could find and take the bloodline back. But his son wrote an article in 1870 about the kids going to school. He was appointed Secretary Treasurer of the AME Church, or the AME body, when the colored citizens met in what was called the Methodist building in Coloma. A lot of this stuff I've gotten, some of it, through non-historians, some through historians that have helped me on their own, but it's convoluted, and it makes me want more. And I ask the question, why is this history not out there for everybody to read it? To the point of, I've got probably more documentation than most families. To the point of my great-grandfather, who's dark-skinned like me, Rufus M. Burgess, in 1878, 28 years after the gold rush, found a gold claim. He found a mine, and they wrote about it in the newspaper, the Mountain Democrat. And they said that basically it was $65 per ton estimated. It produced flattering results, and they took supervisory control of the site. Now, I didn't know this. Thanks to a gentleman by the name of Mr. Lee up there, that was helpful. We disagree, but it was helpful. I got patent letters to my great-grandfather's property. And on the patent letters, when he got his deeds, because he was there in 1872, it said that he could not acquire or hold a gold or claim. And so I questioned, did these letters get given to non-Black descendants of slaves when they got their deeds to property? I also questioned why in 1872, the first township map of Coloma, it's a replicated copy and file. Our family had been there for 50 years already, well, 20 years, and we're not listed as landowners. But yet in the 19th century, somebody came in and wrote in where the Black people are supposed to go based on what one gentleman said, George Johnson. He's the son of C.J. Johnson, who, as far as I'm concerned, could have been a slave owner. I don't want to discredit him, but when you look at it, he's traveling with his partner. So the historians greater than me can tell you what they talked about or how they rarely mentioned the contributions of Black people during the gold rush. But Mr. Johnson, in his late age, wrote a manuscript. He was born in 1868. He's actually in a picture with my great-grandfather. And they took what he said and made it part of the gospel and built that park. Put all the 5 Black families down in one lower end of the park, which they were because it was segregated at one point. But I asked this question today, I'm still in search of. The Nelson Bell property. That man right there, the Rufus Burgess, the guy that got there in 1849, that's listed as white in the census, but somebody clearly went back and changed it. I asked the question, the home that was raised in 1950 by state employees, right? Why don't we talk about that today? And why don't we know where it is? And why has the park kept this a secret? Those are the challenges that I face, and we shouldn't have to face it when we're talking about just true history. I told people today, and I challenge this task force, Google the word African Church, Coloma, and you tell me what comes up. See, what I know is that the Emmanuel Episcopal Church never moved. Longitude and latitude coordinates don't change. They can say what they want, but we've got both deeds to that church. And it didn't make sense for Peter and Elizabeth Wimmer to be listed as landowners when they left and went back to Utah in 1857. Peter died in 1861, and Elizabeth relocated to San Luis Obispo when she came back to California, but yet on the 1872 map, they're listed. We won't get into my great-grandmother being Josephine Pierce Burgess and the H.B. Pierce property surrounded by orchards, but yet there's testimony of my Uncle Marion saying that we packed fruit and served the whole valley. We don't mention H.B. Pierce. But what I find common with history, if you were an abolitionist or if you were African-American, very little written about you. And I feel sorry for the families that have been using as tokens. And then, as Reverend Brown would say, his story was created by someone that didn't know our history. And they made fallacies, and that's hurtful for the families too. I'll land my plan there, and I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. I just had a quick follow-up question. And, you know, my initial question, I was going to ask you, what would reparations ideally look like for you and your family? But you already, you know, eloquently kind of spoke to that. If you would want to reiterate it, that's fine. But I had another question about the Bruce family and Bruce Beach, and I'm just kind of curious, have you or the Burgess family tried to make some connections with the Bruce family just to share histories and stories? But also, before you answer that, I just wanted to acknowledge that you are a fifth generation Californian, right? A true native son. And like Member Holder said, you have so much information related to your family. Most Black Californians, right? We came from the Great Migrations, right? And you are unique in the sense that your family was here well before the Great Migration. So I really wanted to say that it's really an honor to hear from you as a true native son of California. And if you wanted to reiterate, you know, what an ideal reparations package would look like for you and other families similarly situated, that would be great.
Yeah, for your first question, I've not yet reached out to the Bruce family. I was waiting until after this, and so if you've got a direct contact, I'd love to reach out to them. Secondly, I'd say this, you know, I wrote about 5 things of what reparations should look like. Not just for my family, but I feel that I represent the pioneer families that existed in gold country. Those that you will never know because they were buried under different names. But I didn't get to share it with the group, but Karen Robinson wrote a book called Gaining Ground. And she talks about the land and the wealth just in El Dorado County. There's only one copy of it. It's been taken out of production, but I actually got it at Arizona State University and scanned copies. And so from what I've been able to tie to Nelson Bell, buried under a slave name, it was actually Rufus Burgess. What I did learn is tactics did not change. We have probably several of us that acquired wealth and buried under a different name. But what reparation looks like, as a matter of fact, yes, just like the Bruce Beach family. In instances, if we need to do a DNA test with this man, and let's do the probe and put this to rest for once, because I told you I'm a truth seeker. Parks, the institutions, I can't even blame the parks. The institutions has withheld this information. So reparations immediately, the land that's ours, the state of California, yes, they return it and they pay back leases for it. And for everybody that won't know who their loved ones were, develop a fund. Because I know personally that the state pays no taxes. They don't pay taxes on buildings. They don't do any of that for the buildings. So I look at parks different. I look at prisons different based on what I know. The last thing I'll say about reparations is we want policies enacted that actually protect us. The California Constitution clearly, going back to when it was formed, has failed to protect descendants of slaves. We may say in a fallacy that there is, and one of those things is let's just look at our government contracting. And I'll tell you how many people are descendants of slaves that actually have government contracts. So not just the Burgess family. Our ancestors didn't ask for anything. In fact, they worked for free for years. And it's a shame that the state of California, their contracting list, when you look at it, it's less than 1% going to descendants of slaves. So I'd say give somebody the opportunity to hand it. Those are things that can be enacted right now. Yes, cash payment, absolutely, for the trauma. The fact that I don't have these, my mother didn't know all this stuff. The federal, if we can go to the president and ask for money for the refugees, which I agree with because they're here for the sanctuary city, we can go to the president and ask about these federal things that enacted that affected the generational wealth, such as taking a gold claim from my great-grandfather, who actually found it, and being justified under the federal laws of Congress. That's a direct effect to the generational wealth gap that we talk about today. When you look at African-American descendants of slaves in California, across the United States. The gold rush actually made us the 5th largest economy in the world. And it's shameful that when you look at my family compared to my European brothers and sisters that came over here long after us, they're still 5th generation landowners. They have legacy wealth. That's not right. I've done well for myself. I'll continue to do well for I'm not asking for a handout. It's what I'm entitled to. It's my birthright. So I would tell the state of California, yes, those immediate things, just like the Bruce Beach family. We're not talking about the little land that you condemned. We're talking about the land when the lady asked me, what do you know about the land on the north side of the hill? Or my recently retired, well, he's been about 10 years, firefighter, Irish brother that says, John, there's a plot of land that's sat vacant across the river for more than 30 years. I know whose land it is. The state of California knows whose land it is. Let's get down to the business. And let's reinstate what we can while we wait for this task force, finish out educating everybody else as to why this needs to be done. But I hope to be able to help those other families that have lost their loved ones. Indentured servitude, Tina Alexander asked a question a long time ago when she was helping me out, where are the children? I'll tell you where some of them are. Look at the grave sites. Every African-American just about born up there is listed with an estimated year that they were born. You see, one thing that Europeans did do is they kept really good history. They knew even the month, day, and sometime the date they were born. Nobody really cared about slaves, and it was rare that they did, even a descendant. So that's how I found who I believe to be Ida Burgess, along with these pictures that were apparently taken out of the Burgess home. I land. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Grills, you are recognized. Member Grills, you are recognized.
I know my mic wasn't cooperating with me. Thank you. And thank you to the panelists for both moving and very informative and thought-provoking testimony. I have several questions. I'm just going to put them all out there, and whichever one feels reasonable to answer or is answerable, some of them may not be, I'll let you choose. The first question is that in some of the accounts of American Indian enslavement in California, actual data is cited related to the number of deaths or a close approximation to the number of deaths. They cover population declines, the number of people involved and what parts of California were particularly involved. Is there such data available for the enslavement of Black people, people of African ancestry in California? Another question is, do we have any sense of the wealth arising from Black slave labor during the gold rush and any institutions or businesses that benefited from that to this day? The third question, is there a repository of stories like that of Mr. Burgess and the Bruce family? And if not, if so, where can we find those? And if not, do you have any recommendations for how to create such a repository and resources that people can turn to gather that information? Coming up on my last two questions, what information might there be about post-enslavement conditions resulting from the backlash in California, similar to the backlash in the South, things like lynching, incarceration, Jim Crow, et cetera. And then the final question, how would you define a California African descendant of slaves? How many, does it need to go all the way, how many generations back must one go to potentially qualify if there were cash reparations? Do you have to be, yeah, does it go all the way back to the 1800s, the 1700s, and you have to be able to trace that all the way back? So those are my, series of questions sparked by things that you shared today. Thank you.
I'll just go, I dive in the repository and to share stories. And so I was moved by my own personal experiences, knowing that they can help others. And I started a nonprofit called the California African American Gold Rush Museum with the idea that one day we can actually make California great and there would be no need to put African in front of it. But our institutions have failed us, and so there's a need to actually tell true history. I would like to at least have this task force consider that and have historians that are not under the premise of the state of California, because the institution of the state of California has failed us time and time again. I need free thinkers, independent, that are not going to be comprised and constricted to even some of the things that this task force are constricted to, so that we can actually, to Reverend Brown's point, share true history. We don't have to demean other family members or descendants to do that, but there is a way to share history, because what I've experienced and my family has experienced is traumatic, and it hurts still today. So I don't know of a repository. I'd like to put this forth so that it can be one, considering I know there are other pioneers that were brought here. And I'd be willing to put in the research and share all that I have so that others can find loved ones potentially with the way that I was able to find mine. So thank you.
Professor Berry, then Professor Smith.
I'll be brief because I think Dr. Smith will have more specifics on California, but I will say to answer, I think it might have been your third question about the repository. And I wanted to make a comment about the materials that Mr. Burgess was sharing, that African-American history is often like putting together a quilt or looking at a crime scene, and you might have a shred of evidence that's a piece of hair and a spoon that somebody ate off of, and a partial bill of sale, and a photograph that you can't quite see the picture, and maybe something else where the ink dried or had stains on it. That's what Mr. Burgess, I think, has described, and I think you all see it. That's the work that we as historians do, and also genealogists. And I do think we have made major advances in genealogical research and the technologies we have at our fingertips to do that work. I would love to see, I think about StoryCorps on NPR, where they used to do interviews, where they had these little story booths where they would do interviews where Jonathan might be interviewing one of his relatives and just asking them questions about a history, and those were cataloged and shared. I think oral history is a starting point, and to catalog it, and we can use the internet. I think whatever we do or whatever you do, make it free and accessible, put it up online, and allow it to be a database that people can add to and build on, and to tell these stories, and then allow us to put it in museums, allow us to write about these stories and history books. Museums need complete overhaul. They need consultation to go and include stories of people who were there. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to museums and I brought students with me to do archival research, and we're just floored at some of the exhibits that we've seen. And I'm not criticizing all museums, I'm just saying in general, particularly some of the local smaller places, local museums could use some support, and stories like Mr. Burgess's story should be in museums, and many others. We just don't know them. It doesn't mean we can't find them. It doesn't mean that we can't figure it out, but we have to piece together this history, document, story, and artifact one at a time. And that's what it is. And I hope that this creates a movement of people doing just that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Berry. Professor Smith?
Thank you so much for that question, Dr. Grills, or multiple questions. I can probably speak to many aspects of your question, so I'll try to move through them. I think the first question that might be the most helpful to answer is, do we have the same sorts of data and statistics about the enslavement of people of African descent in California that we do about Native people? Probably not. Well, yes and no. Both are actually very difficult to document. The reason that we have so much data about Native Americans is that every time a group of white people slaughtered Native Americans, it got reported in the newspapers and in federal records because these were considered to be federal issues, right? Policy toward Native people was a federal prerogative, and so you would hear federal officials complain about what was happening on the reserves and so forth. So in some ways we have less documentation about that. And part of the issue too is that enslaved Black people compared to Native people of California, of which there were hundreds of thousands when Americans started showing up during the gold rush, relatively small in number. I try to make the case over and over again, not insignificant, because you don't have two California Supreme Court cases surrounding enslaved people without this issue being significant, but the numbers are a lot smaller. I think also that there was an attempt to conceal. Slaveholders sort of knew that this may not fly, and so they were actively, I would imagine, we don't have a ton of evidence of it, but actively trying to hide evidence of their enslavement, right? If you are holding people in slavery, especially after 1855, and there definitely were lots of people, especially in Sonoma County, in that position, that you may be trying to hide that because you know that there's no longer a California Fugitive Slave Act. The census records, as I've mentioned, are really bad for the early gold rush period. For instance, 1850, the federal census, San Francisco, which would probably show us our largest free Black and enslaved populations, is gone. I can't remember if it got lost in the mail back to DC or it was burned, but it doesn't exist. And the 1852 special state census that California did, I think, to try to kind of rectify some of that, is notoriously incomplete. A lot of it was not cared for years, and so it fell under ruin and decay, and you can barely read it. So a lot of the issue is with the loss of records. A lot of the issue is with the deliberate hiding of this history by enslavers who benefited from hiding that. So that's a difficult thing to remedy in terms of finding information, but exactly as Dr. Berry said, it's putting a quilt together. I've literally gone through every issue of the Pacific Appeal and the Elevator, which are the two major Black newspapers in California, gone through them, combed through them for every piece of evidence that I can find. And that's the kind of work you often have to do to reconstruct this history. Talking about Reconstruction Era, I think that Reconstruction is a neglected period in all of U.S. history, even the part that we hear most about formerly enslaved people in the U.S. South, still doesn't resonate with a lot of people. And I think the true violence of that era, we don't even know how many people were victims of lynching in Reconstruction. It's probably, I don't know if it's more, but it's probably more than the post-Reconstruction era, but we just don't know. And so California, I think, is in similar circumstance, that it's a period that is not well understood. Whenever I mention that California did not ratify the 14th and 15th Amendment until the 1950s and 60s, I get a lot of blank stares, like, what? Really, California had a virulently anti-Black, anti-Chinese legislature in the late 1860s and into the 1870s that, did sort of everything possible to block desegregation. We see that in that court case that I mentioned of Ward v. Flood. Even when the Civil Rights Act of 1875 came along that was supposed to get rid of segregation, free Black people in San Francisco fought against that. It ends up going all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court as part of the civil rights cases in 1883. One of those was a California case. And so California was fighting desegregation in public accommodations and theaters up until the 1880s. And so I think that that's really important that we continue to track what happens with Black people's civil rights past the end of slavery, not just in the United States, but specifically in California, because there is very little about the 1860s, 70s, and 80s in that critical period.
Thank you, Professor Smith. Oh, sorry. I did have a couple of follow-up questions for Professor Smith, but I know we have run out of time. But just for it to be on record, I wanted to ask Professor Smith, I was just intellectually curious, one moment, Vice Chair Brown, I was just intellectually curious around, if you could speak to like the legislative history, like if there was any testimony from the lawmakers at the time who were against the Fugitive Slave Act, and did they, go on record by saying like, why would we implement this Fugitive Slave Act when it's in contravention to, the California Constitution? I was just particularly curious on that. But also in doing some research on you, I know you partnered with the ACLU of Northern California, and you're recently a part of a podcast uncovering the state of California's role in the institution of slavery. And so I wanted you to speak to the enslaved men, Robert Perkins, Sandy Jones, Carter Perkins, but maybe you could just plug the work that you did with the ACLU, and then I'll get to Vice Chair Brown.
So I'll just say extremely briefly that absolutely yes, there were voices against this Fugitive Slave Act. Every year that it got renewed, there were people who said, hey, we let this go on long enough, because the rationale for it from the people who wanted to renew it was, well, it just takes a long time to track people down and get them re-enslaved, and we need longer time. And there are people who are saying like, look, we have already given a year, and then in 1853, we have given 2 years, we've given 3 years. So there are definitely people who said, look, this is continuing enslavement in California beyond what the original proposers of this law intended even. So that's the short story there. Yes, and the ACLU is doing a great project called Gold Chains, and I would just really emphasize that everyone check that out. I was interviewed for that in the very first episode, and I talked quite a bit about the Perkins case. And so Tamara Drumlin with the ACLU of Northern California did an excellent job producing that, and she's in charge of that project. So I would really emphasize that everyone take a look at that. Gold Chains, California, Northern California, ACLU.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Smith. Vice Chair Brown, did you have a brief comment?
A quick comment. Thank you, Chair and members of the task force. I have right here in my possession Broussard's, Albert Stephen Broussard. His 1977 doctoral dissertation. There's a wealth of information in this book. Secondly, I would like to mention that I hope that the task force would consider agendizing the notion of all the iconic sites, that Black folks had anything to do with in this state would be put on the historical registry. Why? Because there's not enough talk about Reverend James Jameson Moore, who established the first school in this town, San Francisco, at First AME Zion Church. That's the church where those 800 plus Black people met that night, April 13th, 1858, and responded to Captain Negley, an Irishman now, his invitation that they would get aboard his ship, the Commodore, and sail up to British Columbia. We should have a historical landmark there. And all information that we can gather about that night, none of it I have it, ought to be archived. Second, I would like to suggest we consider agendizing as a reparation measure that of having conversations with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And some may say, oh, I'm not sure about that. But here again, when you don't read the right history, you don't know the true story. Actually, Joseph Smith, in 1830, April the 6th, started what was then the Mormon Church in Fayette, New York. And he was a leader of the abolitionist movement in New York State. But as the church moved westward, there ensued a split. A split, the same as all America was complicit in this thing of race and injustice. And Joseph Smith ran for president of the United States in 1844. 1844. To be exact, he announced his candidacy on January the 29th, 1844. And one of the major planks in his platform was the abolition of slavery by 1850. 1850. In his sentiments, he even preceded anything that Mr. Abraham Lincoln thought of doing politically as it regarded the Black folks. Finally, in the present moment, we have an opportunity. Next year, our Lord willing, through the National NACP and through my initiative as chairman of the Religious Affairs Committee of the National Board, we will collaboratively work together to take to Ghana, West Africa, a minimum of 50 young people who will be known as the Amos C. Brown Scholars. They will go to Ghana, be a part of a seminar and a comprehensive program, and after they will have seen ground zero of that evil enslavement trade, they will come back to the United States from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, National NACP, and the local faith community in this Bay Area. They will come back as ambassadors for social justice.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Vice Chair Brown. Thank you for that.
I'm just laying it out there. In addition to Brother Burgess, we ought to get on
great
this.
time.
Yes.
Thank you so much. And we'll have continued conversations tomorrow. Remember, this is not the last day. We have a whole day ahead of us tomorrow where we'll dig deeper in these discussions. Please excuse me, we did run into our break time, but I wanted to thank our esteemed panelists. Thank you so much, Professor Berry, Professor Smith, and John Burgess for your time and for your testimony. So it is 3:10 and we will move to break. It's going to be a short break. Excuse me for that. We'll reconvene in 5 minutes at 3:15 to continue the agenda, which is item number 9, Department of Justice updates. Thank you.
All right, this was an extended edition of Keeping Up with Congress. This was the AB 3121 Task Force, Reparations Task Force. This is their hearings. We got an opportunity to hear from Jonathan Burgess, Ms. Stacey Brown. Testimonies were, oh my gosh. To hear these stories, this is why reparations has to be paid by this federal government. This is why we have to take this fight to Congress. We absolutely have to. The magnitude of what is owed to us as a people. This debt, honestly, let's just be clear, can't ever be repaid not in our lifetimes or generations to come. This is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, 400 years of pain and suffrage by our people. We got to take this fight to Congress. So I applaud them for all the work that they're doing in California to create the groundswell that we need to take our fight to Washington. So again, this was an extended version of Keeping Up with Congress today. I wanted to bring to you as much as I could. I follow Brother Jonathan in this story. I have yet to meet Stacey Brown, but I definitely want to meet her and hear more as a white woman, knowing her family history, sharing her family history, sharing the history of California and their role in slavery. You know, that's a bold move. We are here and this is now, and reparations is a debt that will be paid by the federal government. I just believe that we're going to see this thing come to fruition and it'll be beneficial to generations to come. And this is what will heal America. And reparations, as I've been saying, reparations will make America great. So I am Tamara Johnson Shealey. I ask that you go to the website. You know, I'm always passing this collection plate, y'all. Go to the website. Go to the website, donate, be a part of this campaign, be a part of this movement. We have to get to Washington and reparations has to be paid. So I will see you. Actually, I am going to come back tomorrow. There's another part of the hearings that I like to play. So I will be back at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tomorrow for another part 2 of these hearings tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You guys have a good afternoon, and I will see you tomorrow for another special edition of Keeping Up with Congress, California AB 3121, the Reparations Task Force hearings. Thank you for tuning in for Keeping Up with Congress. I am Tamara Johnson Shealey, your candidate for the United States Senate. I'm a progressive Democrat that believes that reparations will make America great. It is time that we bridge the divide in this country. Please go to the website. That's tamara4georgia.com. www.tamara4georgia.com. Please join me Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here for Keeping Up with Congress.